Hi, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and literature. So, today's video is a shortish, I'll explain why in a second, summary of Discovery, Season 1, Episode 1, some of the narrative elements in it, because I watched it today. Now, I have recorded my honest reactions to all of the scenes of it, and that video was an hour and a half. This is a summary video to go over some of the major points to it, of how I reacted to it and some of the things that I liked and didn't like. And one of the first things is like, Discovery looks absolutely amazing. There's clearly a lot of money being spent on the visual effects, on the filming, on the locations, on the costuming. The Klingons, as weird as they look, their costuming is absolutely astounding, and it really gives a sense of them being alien. Um, but I have to say, my biggest problem, we'll get onto some of the minor things, but the biggest problem I had was the whole construction of this initial narrative event. So the basic premise of the story of episode 1 is Captain Giorgio's ship is repairing or finding out why a satellite, a communication satellite relay, has been destroyed. They go out there it looks like part of it's been blown up. They find this strange floating Klingon artifact, giant sort of bizarre tomb thing in space. And then it turns out there's a giant Klingon ship right next to it, hiding under a cloak. And then at the end, Michael Burnham tries to lead a mutiny to say that they have to kill the Klingons straight away before the Klingons kill them, and then a whole Klingon fleet arrives. That's a synopsis, very brief synopsis of what happens in this first episode. So let's talk about this in a wee bit more detail. Why is the Klingon thing there? That's not explained. It's some sort of beacon, some sort of holy beacon or site that this cult of Kalis has. But it's floating in Federation space. Not only that, it's floating in Federation space just a relatively short distance from where a communication satellite was that presumably has all sorts of sensors and sensor arrays on it to scan the local area. So this is Federation space. Either this thing has been sitting there, the Federation came along and installed a satellite, and no one noticed the giant floating tomb thing from the Klingons. Or at some point after the satellite had been installed, the Klingons moved their floating tomb thing to here without the Federation getting wind of it. So there are a couple of strange issues here because, number one, this is Federation space. It's been explored by the Federation. Giorgio even says that there's a starbase 3 light years away. There's an Andorian settlement 6 light years away. This is regular Federation space, albeit on the edges, but it's not described as being on the edges with Klingon territory. So we get a sense that if there's a starbase is there and there's an Andorian settlement, this is not, they've only recently annexed it. And they had a communication satellite there that's, for communications. They've been there a while, which means the Federation had installed a satellite, obviously prior to the starbase being set up. You need communications first. So they install a satellite, a starbase is set up, and in no point in the time that it took to do all of that did anyone ever discover the big floating Klingon artifact. So that seems, I don't like referring to them as plot holes, but it's an issue with how the plot has been constructed. So let's look at it from a different perspective. Let's say that this is on the border with Klingon space, that the Federation moved in, annexed all of this stuff, but this was the far end of Klingon space where there was this sort of backwater with this artifact, and it was disguised by the asteroid field. so no one noticed it. If that's the case, then that wasn't made clear in the TV show. Um, it just seems strange that this thing that is so important to this cult of Kalis within the Klingon empire, or the Klingon fractured realm as it is at this point in the timeline, that this has been floating here. If it's a sacred object, why did they put up with Federation intrusion for multiple years before now? So it seems unlikely that the Federation expanded into this area and the thing was already there, because the Klingons would have reacted sooner. So it can't have been there before they set up the satellite. It must have been there after they set up the satellite. But when they sent a ship out to install the satellite, why didn't the satellite, this communications relay that has sensors on it, detect this thing coming into the area? Now, this floating temple thing, this beacon, does it have warp engines? It looks like a giant sculpture. None of that is explained. So how could it have warped in? There's just this bizarre, why does this even exist? It seems a very cumbersome or convoluted way to orchestrate a conflict between the Klingons and the Federation. We know, and we are told in the narrative, that the Klingons are warlike, and this particular aspect of Klingon society wants war with the Federation. So they want to manufacture a war with the Federation. Okay, if you take that as the antagonist, as their plan, what could they do? Well, they could quite easily blow up a satellite and then wait for the Federation to arrive and be aggressive and get the Federation to shoot at them. Or once the Federation's put it, blow up the second satellite, and the Federation could keep repairing it until eventually some hot-headed commander accidentally fires on them and it gives them an excuse to attack. There is an underlying thread that this is a fringe cult group who want to unify all of the Klingons. So what they need is an excuse for the war, an excuse to rally all Klingons to their point of view. And this is why bringing in religion is so interesting. But here's my take on it. If you want to set this up where we have the Federation misstepping accidentally to cause this tension that the Klingons then, instead of using diplomacy to sort out, leap on as an excuse for having a war, why not have, instead of the Shinjo being flown out to repair the satellite, this being the very edge of the Federation sort of controlled area, the Shinjo is sent out to install a new satellite. They are putting in something to expand the Federation territory. This expansion then encroaches on this planet that they thought was uninhabited, but the planet could have a temple on it, a temple to Kalis, or this strange Klingon religion. When the Shinju arrives, they install this thing, they scan this odd object on the planet. Instead of Michael shooting across space in yet another annoying CGI fest of someone in a spacesuit flying through asteroids, which has become cliched at this point, instead of that, she beams down and unknowingly is now defiling sacred ground to the Klingons with her presence, leading her to kill the guard, which sets off the chain of events. That makes a lot more sense. It achieves exactly the same thing and is actually hitting the same story beats that we have in the show, but it removes this whole, how did that thing get here? What's the actual timeline of when were these things installed? If the satellite's installed first, how did the temple get there? If the temple was there, how did they install the satellite without noticing the temple? And people who say, oh, but the temple was shrouded by this cloaking device, this cloaking field that they were unaware of. The first thing that the Shinjo notices is there's a strange reading. And if this is a communications relay and it's trying to beam through communications all over the sector, and this disruption is so close um, to it, that means the communications relay would always have issues. So they would have noticed before now, and the Klingons would have blown it up before now. It doesn't make sense the way that it's been outlined in the TV show in the episode. But by moving it down to the planet, by having the Shinjo arrive to basically expand the border, you have the Shinjo as being more proactive in pushing the Federation outwards. It suits the whole narrative that they want to set up a starbase. Because as far as I'm aware, that starbase is irrelevant. It doesn't factor into this story in any major way. So they want to set up a starbase. They've arrived in the area. They launch the whole satellite, and that uncovers this. They unknowingly do this thing. The Klingon sees on their trespassing on their sacred territory, and you have the episode basically play out the way that it does. To my mind, that's a much more cohesive arc that shows everyone as being more active rather than reactive. The Shinjo, instead of reacting to a damaged relay and being space engineered to go out and fix a satellite, which, let's face it, they're basically the telecom repair guys. Why are we interested in this? They're much more active. They're part of the frontier and expanding the frontier, what the early Star Trek universe seemed to be all about. So I think that's the first point, that there's an issue with the construction of the narrative, but there's a very simple way to tweak it so that the narrative flows much more evenly and makes a lot more sense. Now, let's talk a little bit about Michael Burnham. I recall from having watched this when it first came out and the fallout from it that there are issues with Michael's character. But in this episode, there aren't any real issues with Michael's character until the very last couple of minutes. Michael and Giorgio are introduced walking through the planet over the desert, where they have this great exchange, which shows that they have been working together a long time. We know Giorgio is the captain and Michael is her first officer. There's a strong working relationship, a sense of familiarity and friendship, a long-standing history between the two of them, and they trust each other implicitly. It's an excellent sequence, and then is ruined by the fact that when Michael is introduced, she is asked about how quickly the storm is going to get there, and she estimates it with hours, minutes, and seconds, which indicates to the viewer, yes, her estimation, her guess is incredibly accurate. So it gets across that she's smart, she's well prepared, she knew the answer to it off the top of her head. She was prepared for all of this. She's an excellent first officer, which is why Giorgio trusts her. But then almost immediately, that is undermined when, oh, look, the storm's getting here sooner than I thought. You go, oh, so she's just cocky and useless then. So when she had said that earlier on about how long the storm was going to get there, and she'd estimated hours, minutes, and seconds, she was just making that up. And it was meant to be a joke. And it wasn't accurate in the slightest. And they can't communicate with the ship in orbit because it would have been able to tell them almost exactly, this is how fast the storm is moving. We're tracking your signal. So they undermine the character development of Michael at the very, very beginning for nothing more than a cheap narrative reason to suddenly have, well, what are they going to do? How are they going to get out of this predicament? And then we have, well, they can't seem to communicate with their ship, that they, as humans on the planet, are too small to be visually located by the ship. Now, it's not that the people on the ship are standing there with telescopes. The people on the ship have sensors. They can look down. They can detect life forms. They know roughly the region that Giorgio and Burnham are in because they were by the village. So it's not complicated. When they see the storm coming in, they could easily fly down and be able to visually pick them up or be much closer to them, that they'd be able to pick up their communicators or some sort of reading or scan from them. So this is where Star Trek traditionally uses that pseudoscience or the science speak to try and excuse away something, that the storm has some ionic flux or it's inverting the polarity of the blah, blah, blah. It's actually necessary here because the plan that Giorgio comes up with to get them spotted is so dumb and so ludicrous that it's insulting to the people watching. She has them walk to carve out the delta of Starfleet in sand, in loose sand, while a storm front is coming in that is blowing sand and rock everywhere. Giorgio's great plan is to walk in a giant delta because although the humans are too hard to see, their footprints are clearly going to be visible from orbit. This is just dumb. Admittedly, it leads to that great visual. I can't knock the visual. But here's a slightly different way of doing this. As they're walking around, when they step on the sand, if the sand underneath was then suddenly to glow a different color, it's an alien planet. They've broken through the crust on it, and it's led to a bioluminescence that suddenly would reveal their presence. You could do it in exactly the same way, create the same effect, but it would make a lot more sense than, yes, it's just their footprints in the sand. How deep are their footprints? And even then, there's a wind blowing. We see the wind. We see the dust blowing across. There's a storm coming in that's wiping out all of the evidence of where they've been walking. How is this a plan? So that would be the second point about there are great ideas here and great visuals, but sometimes the narrative, it seems that it has been wedged in or mechanically altered to try and fix it to support the visual rather than have the visual illustrate and illuminate the narrative that you've created. But let's talk about the crux at the end of the episode where Michael decides to mutiny. So faced with this giant Klingon battle cruiser, Cerro says that they have to retreat. Okay, side note here. Cerro is a character on the bridge of this spaceship, makes no sense whatsoever. He is a card. He is a self-confessed card. His species is a prey species that sees everything as a threat and therefore always counsels the brave Sir Robin strategy of run away. Why is he on a starship? There's no he could have joined Starfleet or joined the Federation. Like we find out later on that as a Kelpian, like he's the first Kelpian to join. Fair enough. But he could have joined the Science Academy or the Research Academy or sat on a base somewhere and conducted research. But no, he wanted to explore. And in exploring, wants always to run away because everything is a threat. How he managed to get to a senior officer status in a starship beggars belief. It would have made much more sense if, when confronted with certain situations, his prey response kicks in. But they don't do that. They say that he is automatically bred to want to always run away. So immediately, he's not a believable character. How he is meant to be able to command people when his command is always going to be, brave Sir Robin, run away, run away. This is a threat. Here's my analysis. Now, admittedly, it took Leonard Nimoy a number of episodes to settle into the character of Spock. So you can't criticize the actor for this. Writers often are playing around with how they do the character initially. Like this is the very first episode. It is, there are going to be moments where it's going to take time to settle into characters. But it just from a conceptual standpoint, the idea of a serving Starfleet officer on a frontline vessel that goes out and does all of these missions in the unknown, being perpetually afraid of the unknown and thinking that everything is going to try to kill them, it doesn't make sense. The psychology of it doesn't make sense. But anyway, going back to Burnham and her decision to mutiny. So Burnham contacts, actually, let's go back a wee bit further. They're standing on the bridge. The bright light, the flare goes off, blinding everyone. It's red alert. They're in a potential combat situation. And Burnham says to Giorgio, permission to leave the bridge. Now, that's actually a nice touch. She doesn't just leave, she asks the captain's permission. I like it when TV shows like this pay attention to military protocol, because it gives it that sense of realism, that sense of believability that allows you to buy into the more fantastic aspects of the narrative. Giorgio says, basically, why? Like, we're in the middle of a situation here. And Burnham says, you need to trust me. This is important. I'll be back. And it shows the strength of their relationship, the strength of their trust, that Giorgio goes, yep, fine, go. And here's where we start getting into the issues I have with the character. Burnham then turns up in her own quarters and she opens a voice channel to Sarek, the Vulcan ambassador. It's a private diplomatic channel. And it's a hologram. Now, I get that hologram communication was introduced slightly earlier with the Admiral. And I have a real problem with holograms, not only in this particular TV show, but used in a lot of science fiction. Because while it's convenient to have these characters seemingly interact in the 3D space, that's not really how holograms work. There need to be cameras everywhere to record what they're doing, and there needs to be a display. And the display, at least in our time, will be two-dimensional, that the image is projected on to give the illusion of 3 dimensions. Now, let's say that, yes, Burnham has holo projectors that can project Sarek's image, and that Sarek has holo projectors that can project Burnham's image, and the computers somehow across the entire galaxy are able to communicate with each other to sync all of this up. It's a bit of a stretch. I know it's a narrative convenience. It's one of those things that just annoys me, but you kind of let it go. It just, every single time I see hologram communication in science fiction, I always get a little bit worked up because it doesn't make sense. They're not looking each other in the eyes. They're looking at a display. When Sarek leans against the table in Burnham's room, how is his hologram doing that? Does he happen to have a table right next to him that's exactly the right height that he can do that? He then turns to the side to look at where her hologram is. So we get this sense that they are in the same physical space. Yes, that's very convenient for the visual, but it makes no sense for the diegesis for the story world. Now, the other thing about this that is a recurring problem across all sorts of TV shows and films, which is Burnham is in a hurry, so she makes a call to someone important to get information. Luckily, Sarek was on his own, seemingly not busy with anything else. He wasn't in the bathroom, he wasn't having his dinner, he wasn't asleep. He was fully dressed and happened to be in an area where he could receive holographic communication from Burnham in real time, on a secure diplomatic channel that's presumably highly confidential, doesn't have anyone around him who might be listening in, and doesn't want to say, actually, Michael, this is not a good time. This happens so often in films because they need to move things along quickly. But there's so rarely any acknowledgement of the fact she's in one part of the galaxy talking to him in another part of the galaxy. It's bad enough on this planet trying to get someone who lives on the other side of the world because of time zones. And here we have Burnham sending a message at her convenience to Sarek, and Sarek going, yep, everything's fine. I just so happen to know all of the information that you need to know, have it to hand, and also I'm ready to receive your call in private because there's no one around. That sort of narrative convenience drops me out of my suspension of disbelief of what I'm willing to accept, because it is just, Unkindly put, it is just lazy. That there's no acknowledgement of, even for a moment, Sarek saying, uh, hold on for a moment, Michael, I need to secure the communication, and turn to say, please leave the room. Just to give even a couple of seconds dedicated to that, to acknowledge that Sarek is not existing solely for Michael's purposes or the plot's purposes. Some acknowledgement that he is meant to have his own internal life and his own interactions in the universe. He is not waiting on the wings simply to be brought in when it's convenient for Michael. A couple of seconds of that sort of thing, of Sarek saying, actually, you need to be quick. I am on my way to a meeting. What can I do for you? You know, acknowledges that there is life occurring in the rest of the universe, in the rest of the fiction that's been created. And it is just slightly lazy, and it gives the impression that this entire universe is created artificially and solely for the purposes of the narrative. And that's what makes it ring false. And that's little things like that, little moments like that, where the universe is forced to fit the narrative of the characters. That's why these stories sometimes feel artificial and feel forced. So adding in little tiny moments like that are the things that make it more believable. So Michael gets this information at this point from Sarek, highly confidential information from the Vulcans. The Vulcans have diplomatic relations with Klingon. So here we run into the second problem. The Federation, and in particular Starfleet, is having an issue with the Klingons. Now, in my head, I get the Federation and Starfleet confused. I know they are two separate things. But here we have a Starfleet vessel in a potential confrontation with the Klingons. And Starfleet knows that the Vulcans have diplomatic relations with the Klingons. Now, if something similar happened in our world, in our time, where two countries run into tensions with one another, but don't have diplomatic relations between them, then it is very common for them to turn to a mutual contact who has diplomatic relations with both to be the mediator. So in this circumstance, I can understand why the Klingons don't contact the Vulcans, because the Klingons want war. But why does Giorgio not immediately contact the Vulcans to say, we've run into the Klingons, we need one of your ships here to act as an intermediary? That is your second call. Your first call is obviously back to HQ to go send backup. But that doesn't seem to be even discussed here, that although the Vulcans have diplomatic relations, don't bother calling them. Don't get them officially on the phone to give advice. Now, Michael has run off in secret to talk to Sarek. That's unofficial and informal. Giorgio, as captain, could formally contact the Vulcans. And that would explain why maybe the Vulcans don't want to share their information. We don't know. This is now one of those things that suddenly feels like a hole in the plot that doesn't make sense. So Michael comes back with this information from Sarek, that what the Vulcans did to establish diplomatic relations with the Klingons was every time they encountered them, they shot them, until eventually the Klingons contacted them and said, do you want to talk instead of shooting us? So Michael, burdened with this knowledge, rushes onto the bridge. And I'll pause again here in where we're going through the narrative to point something out. When Michael left, she went down to her quarters. So she left the bridge, got on a turbo lift, got the turbo lift down to the right floor, walked along the corridor, went in, had a chat to Sarek, walked back along the corridor, got back in the turbo lift, went back up and went to the bridge. Awesome. She could have just gone to the captain's ready room. It's like 6 feet away. So in the middle of a red alert, potential battle situation, she needs to get this information. Let's say she needs the holo projectors. It's not available everywhere. But it's available in the ready room. We were literally in there a couple of scenes ago where the admiral from Starfleet was talking to Giorgio. So why not ask the captain permission to step into your ready room? It's important. Instead of wasting the additional time to go to your room. It also means that when she came back, she could open the door to the ready room and say, Captain, it is imperative that I speak to you in private. Now, why am I saying that this scene should be changed, that Michael needs to speak to Giorgio in private? Because Burnham is the captain's first officer. She's just been given confidential, private information that is not widely known about the Vulcan relationship to the Klingons. And she's gotten it from a private source, and it's not an official communication. So she will not want to be broadcasting this to the entire assembled command crew. They mightn't have security clearance. She wouldn't want them to have this information anyway. And she got it from slightly, not nefarious, but improper channels. She got it from back channels. So you would think the immediate correct response here would be to ask Giorgio to step into the ready room so that she could explain all this in person. The reason it seems that the writers didn't do this was they wanted that confrontation and that outburst on the bridge because it makes Burnham look insane, because she's directly insubordinate to Giorgio. But this goes against all of the aspects of Burnham's character and Giorgio's character that we've had up until now. This seems remarkably out of character for Michael. You can achieve exactly the same response and exactly the same detail by having Michael ask Giorgio to meet her in the ready room, have them discuss it, Giorgio give her final, no, we are not doing that. We're not opening fire on the Klingons. We don't open fire first. And that's that. Goes to walk out, and Michael yells after her. That way, you still can have the reaction of the bridge crew all suddenly doing that snap turn of, oh my God, Michael just yelled at the captain. Giorgio could spin around and storm back in, close the door and go privacy. And that's when you have that second half of the confrontation. That would make it seem much more authentic. It would preserve 95% of all of the dialogue and what they shot. But instead, you have this bizarre thing where Michael betrays a confidential source and betrays all this information and just bandies it about on the bridge, which seems so out of character. We then have this moment where Michael says, I'm not emotional, with tears in her eye. This is not a criticism of what the actor is doing. The director must be standing there going, I want you to be emotional. But we get this dissonance between the dialogue saying, I'm not emotional, this is the logical course, while crying, while looking upset. And again, you get that discordant note between what you're seeing and what you're being told. From the flashback sequence earlier, we see that Michael had reacted very badly to the questions about obviously the incident where her parents were murdered by the Klingons. So there's the point of emotion. That's the thing that we're talking about. But Michael's already killed the Klingon. So, her getting upset now by talking about Klingons doesn't seem as important. But in this, she's aged from being that child. She's no longer a child. So wouldn't this be the perfect opportunity for, in that moment, Michael to suddenly become really cold, really logical? Captain, this is the only way forward. We do this. We must do this. And because we've established this rapport between Giorgio and Burnham, where we've seen their friendship, their camaraderie, we've seen that they have a long-standing relationship, they like each other, Giorgio trusts her. For Giorgio suddenly to see her officer and her friend change from who she knows into this cold, logical, ultra rational person would be deeply unsettling. And you would have then the reason for that response. But instead, we get this very emotional, teary scene when she's trying to convince the captain. And very few people are convinced by your argument when you just start crying and go, you have to believe me. I doubt military officers and serving officers do that sort of thing. It just struck me as so false and fake, and it felt artificial. And then you suddenly have that moment where Michael then decides, you know, despite my career and everything that I've done, I'm now going to mutiny. I'm going to disable Giorgio and take command. And so she does the Vulcan neck pinch, another little, nod to the fact that she was raised on Vulcan, to knock Giorgio out, and then immediately steps out to order all of these things to happen. And despite the fact that they are in red alert, despite the fact that they're keyed up for battle, she can't just say, target that and fire. I thought red alert was meant to be shields up, get the weapons primed, get ready for action. But here it's, well, load some torpedoes. Right now, target that thing. And in the meantime, Giorgio's woken up. Maybe Michael's neck pinch wasn't particularly good. Who knows? But it seems remarkably convenient that she's been unconscious for all of about 12 seconds. It's just disappointing that everything sort of falls around this. And this is meant to be a huge moment in the narrative. This is the turning point in the narrative to leave you on that hook for the second episode. But one last thing that I want to talk about in terms of the narrative here is Giorgio's logic about not wanting to fire first doesn't make sense. Number one, they are in Federation space and the Klingons have some bizarre artifact, they don't know what it is, plus a warship have come into Federation space. The Klingons have invaded. The Klingons are obviously there. They're not meant to be there. This is Federation space. Therefore, the Klingons have invaded. That is an act of aggression. And that should be at least partial justification for firing on the Klingons at this point. Number two, upon finding the Klingon incursion into their space that's been disguised with a cloaking field, which is, well, is it a spy? Is it something like this? They send out an officer. Burnham flies out there and is attacked by the Klingons. An officer of the Federation, an officer of Starfleet, has been attacked by the Klingons in Federation space. So this isn't the Federation's going to fire first. The Klingons attack them first. Then we have the giant Klingon ship, the cloaking, in front of them. So this is a threat, and it is a threat to the ship. It is a threat to a space station, and it is a threat to a colony in Federation space. This is not the Federation firing first for no reason. They are refusing, the Klingons are refusing to answer hails, they're refusing to communicate. Giorgio has ample reasons to fire now. And to say, oh, we don't fire first. So trespass is okay. Attempting to kill one of your officers is okay. Nearly killing one of your officers, because Michael nearly died anyway, that's all okay, because the spaceship didn't fire. So I have a real problem with Giorgio's rationale here, because even the Admiral says, absent of provocation, like, don't do anything. You're like, they've already been provoked. They're in your territory. They've flown a warship into your territory. Like, at least fire a shot across their bow, give them a warning shot. But Giorgio's just sitting there going, don't do anything. So I have a couple of issues with the narrative in Discovery Season 1, Episode 1. So let's see what Episode 2 is like and see if things improve from there. thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.